Picture yourself in a busy airport, people rushing past, voices echoing, screens flashing with flight numbers. In the middle of all that movement, one woman stands alone. Her family has just walked away, leaving her with no suitcase, no return ticket, and no plan. What happens when the people you trusted most decide you are no longer part of their journey? This is not only a story of being left behind, it is a story of finding strength, of choosing independence, and of rewriting the future on your own terms. The airport was alive with movement. Screens flashed flight numbers, voices echoed through the halls, and rolling suitcases clicked across the floor. In the middle of all that noise, I stood still. My son and his wife had just walked away, leaving me with no suitcase, no return ticket, and no plan. They had promised me a family trip, a chance to heal after my husband's funeral. I believed them. I even sold my pearls to help pay for the flights. But when the airline attendant scanned my papers, she told me there was no return booking under my name. My son and his wife didn't even look back. I held my purse close, realizing I had been discarded. My daughter-in-law's words echoed in my mind. "We only bought you a one-way ticket. You'll figure it out." She said it like it was nothing, like I was expected to solve my own way home. My son didn't correct her. He just adjusted his sunglasses and kept walking. I sat on a bench holding my phone, realizing I had been left behind. People passed by, some glancing at me, others looking away quickly. One woman smiled politely, but her eyes dropped to the empty space where my luggage should have been. I wanted to disappear, but I stayed upright, chin high, refusing to collapse in front of strangers. The truth hit me harder than the noise around me. I had not been forgotten by accident. I had been excluded on purpose. They had taken my luggage, too, claiming they would handle it. I realized then that I was not part of their plan. I was only useful until I wasn't. I thought about calling someone, but who? My sister had passed years ago. My friends had their own families, their own struggles. I wasn't about to admit to anyone that I had been left behind at an airport by my own family. No, I would not hand them my humiliation. Instead, I reached into my sweater, close to my heart, where I had tucked a small envelope. Inside was the business card of a lawyer, my husband's old friend. Years ago, he had told me, "If you ever need anything, come find me." That memory became my lifeline. I looked at the departure board. Their flight was on time. Mine was not, because there was no flight for me. I sat there until their names disappeared from the screen, until the loudspeaker announced final boarding. I didn't follow them. I didn't chase them. I stayed seated holding my phone, knowing I had a choice to make. I opened my notes app and typed one line. "This will be the last time I trust them." Then I scrolled to the contact I had saved under lawyer. My husband had introduced us years ago when we signed our first will. He had always said, "If you ever need anything, I'll be there." I pressed call. When he answered, I didn't explain. I didn't waste words. I said, "I need to update my will." At that moment, I was no longer the forgotten mother standing alone at gate B22. I was a woman preparing to reclaim her voice. What happens when betrayal forces you to choose? You stop waiting for rescue and start writing your own future. Before the airport, there was silence. My husband had passed away only weeks earlier, and the house we built together felt empty. His slippers were still under the bed, his toothbrush still beside mine, and his chair sat waiting in the corner. 42 years of marriage had ended in one sudden moment. He had died from a stroke, quick and final. One minute he was humming in the kitchen, asking where I had hidden the cinnamon, and the next he was gone. The funeral was short, just as he would have wanted. He never liked being the center of attention. People brought flowers, casseroles, and stories, but I was too numb to absorb them. Days blurred together. Some mornings I didn't leave the house. I sat in his chair, trying to remember the sound of his laugh, the way he looked at me when I entered a room. I tried to remember who I was before I became the widow. Then my son came by. He hugged me lightly and said, "Mom, we think it would be good for you to get away for a bit." His wife stood beside him, nodding with practiced sympathy. They spoke of a trip, of fresh air, of family time. They said it would help me breathe again. I wanted to believe them. The thought of leaving Tennessee, of feeling sand between my toes, stirred something inside me. I hadn't been out of the state in years. For a moment, I felt hope. Later that week, I opened my jewelry box. Inside was the gold wedding band my husband had given me on our 10th anniversary. He had saved for months to buy it. I wore it every day until the day he died. Holding it now, I felt its weight, its warmth, and then I let it go. I sold it at a pawn shop and used the money to contribute to the trip. It felt good to be included, to be part of something again. I packed carefully, choosing my softest sweater, the one he always said made me look classy. I tucked a photo of him into my bag, along with a beach towel and a book I had been meaning to read. I thought I was preparing for healing. But what I didn't know was that I was preparing for betrayal. At the airport, I realized the truth. My son and his wife had not invited me out of love or grief. They had included me for convenience, for what I could give, not for who I was. The return ticket was never purchased. My luggage was never meant to be mine. The silence that followed was not the silence of forgetting. It was the silence of being considered and then discarded. They had looked at me, thought about me, and still decided I was unnecessary. I stood at the counter, clutching my papers, while the agent explained that my name was not listed on the return flight. I turned to my son, hoping for correction, but he only smiled weakly. His wife shrugged, sipping her coffee. "You're an adult. You can figure it out." That was the moment I understood. I was not part of their plan. I was not part of their family trip. I was only part of their convenience. When the people closest to you decide you are disposable, the question becomes, what will you do with the strength they left behind? At the airline counter, the truth became clear. The attendant tapped at her keyboard, then looked at me with polite concern. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but there's no return flight booked under your name." I blinked, holding out my papers. "I'm with my son's family. The reservation should be under Monroe." She checked again, frowning. "I do see a Monroe group, but the return tickets are only for 6 passengers. You're not listed." Her words cut deeper than I expected. I turned slowly, scanning the terminal, and spotted my son and his wife near a coffee stand. They were laughing at something on her phone, as if nothing had happened. I walked over, still clutching my itinerary. "The agent says I don't have a return ticket. Can you check yours?" My son glanced up, discomfort flashing across his face before he forced a weak smile. "Oh, right, yeah. We figured you might want to stay a little longer. Enjoy some peace and quiet." My heart paused. "What?" His wife chimed in, her tone flat. "We only bought you a one-way. Flights are expensive, and let's be honest, you've got plenty of time. You're retired, right?" I stared at them, voice thin. "I thought this was a round trip." She shrugged, sipping her coffee. "You're an adult. You can figure it out. You've got your phone. There's Wi-Fi. Or call someone to help. This is a vacation, not a charity drive." I looked at my son, hoping for correction, but he didn't meet my eyes. "It just made more sense this way, Mom. We thought it'd be good for you to stay a few extra days, maybe even see some friends." "I didn't pack for more days," I said quietly. "Well," his wife replied, checking her nails, "there are stores." I realized then that I didn't have my suitcase. They had checked their bags together at the curbside drop-off. My small carry-on had been waved away with the words, "Let us handle it, Blake, just relax." My bag was probably still in the trunk. They hadn't just left me without a return flight. They had taken my luggage, too. So I don't have a flight, I don't have my things, and you didn't think I need to know that before we got to the airport? You're overreacting, she said flatly. You said you wanted to be included. Well, this is how we do things flexibly. We didn't mean anything by it. You're just so emotional since Dad passed, and we thought this would be easier. Easier for who? I asked. Neither of them answered. Instead, she zipped up her designer bag and said, "We've got to head to security. Our boarding group's almost up." And that was that. They walked away. No hug, no apology, no recognition that I had been reduced to an afterthought. I stood there as they moved toward the TSA line. Her heels clicked confidently, his face void of shame. For a moment, I felt like the floor beneath me had given way, pulling me into a loneliness no one warns you about, the kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from being discarded by the very people who should love you most. I stepped aside, hands shaking, and sat on a bench against the wall. I didn't cry. I was too far past tears. Instead, I pulled out my phone. Not to call them, not to call anyone in the family. I opened my notes app and typed a single line. This will be the last time I trust them. Then I scrolled to the contact saved under lawyer. My husband had introduced us years ago when we signed our first will. He had always said, "If you ever need anything, I'll be there." I pressed call. When he answered, I didn't explain. I said, "I need to update my will." At that moment, I was no longer the forgotten mother at the airport. I was a woman preparing to reclaim her voice. When betrayal strips away trust, the next step is not survival, it is taking back control. The cab ride from the airport felt longer than it was. I gave the driver an address I hadn't spoken aloud in years, the law office of my husband's old friend. The envelope of emergency cash I had kept hidden was enough to get me there. As the city streets passed by, I realized I wasn't just leaving the airport. I was leaving behind the role of someone who waited to be included. When I walked into the office, the lawyer looked surprised. "Blake," he said, standing slowly, "I haven't seen you in years. I was sorry to hear about Jake." "Thank you," I replied, sitting carefully. "I'm here because I need to change my will." He raised an eyebrow. "All right. Anything specific?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I want to remove my son and daughter-in-law from every part of it." He paused, studying me. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He didn't ask why. He knew me well enough to understand I didn't make decisions lightly. He opened a folder, clicked his pen, and waited. "I'd like to add a new beneficiary," I continued, "an organization that supports older adults who've been mistreated by their families." "That's very specific," he said. "I've become very specific," I answered. He nodded. "We can absolutely do that. I'll need some paperwork from the organization." "I already have it." I slid a pamphlet across the desk, one I had picked up months earlier at the community center. At the time, I never thought I would use it for myself. As he copied the details, I leaned forward. "And while we're at it, I want to make sure that what happened to me, being left behind, taken advantage of, is something I can respond to legally, not just emotionally." "You mean financial exploitation?" he asked. "Yes, elder abuse," I said clearly. "Is there anything in the law that protects people like me?" "There is," he replied, more serious now, "especially if the person being taken advantage of is vulnerable. Did they access your funds directly?" "No," I said, voice steady. "I gave it freely, but under false pretenses. They led me to believe I was part of something I wasn't." He nodded slowly. "We can explore that. At the very least, I can help ensure they never touch another cent of what's yours." "Good," I said, "because I want this change notarized, effective immediately, and I want it sent to a third-party executor. I don't want anyone in my family touching my affairs ever again." "You got it," he said, typing quickly. For the next hour, we went line by line through the old will, name by name, number by number. Every assumption my husband and I had built was now dismantled, not out of spite, but out of clarity. By the time I left, I had a new folder in hand, a new plan, and a new understanding of who I could count on. I checked into a modest motel downtown. It wasn't where I would stay forever, but it was enough for the night, enough time to rest, enough time to remind myself that a woman with no return ticket is not a woman who has lost. She is a woman who has finally chosen her own direction. The next morning, sunlight poured through thin curtains. The paperwork was done. It was official. My son and daughter-in-law were no longer part of my will. Their names, once written in confident ink, were now erased. In their place was something stronger: intention. I didn't do it in anger. I did it slowly, deliberately, carefully, because some choices aren't made in storms. They're made in stillness. When you take back control of your future, the question becomes, where will you build your new beginning? When the movers arrived, I told them I only wanted a few things: Jake's favorite chair, the wedding album, my mother's quilt, and a box of books. Nothing else. Not the furniture we bought together, not the dishes that once held Sunday dinners, not the mattress we replaced after 30 years. Just the pieces that still felt like truth. I walked through the room slowly, the kitchen where I baked every birthday cake, the living room where we danced barefoot on our anniversary, the hallway where Jake had fallen that day, coffee still warm in his hand. I didn't cry. I had cried enough. On the kitchen counter, I left the keys in a sealed envelope with a short note. "Don't call, don't ask. I am exactly where I want to be." The ride to my new place took under 2 hours, but it felt like crossing into another life. The sign out front read, "Willow Grove, Independent Living for Seniors with Dignity." I had toured it once before with Jake. He wanted to make sure we had options, though I told him I'd never leave our home. "Maybe one day," he said, "if they have good pudding." Willow Grove had more than pudding. It had sunlight pouring through wide windows, hallways that smelled of lemon instead of antiseptic, soft jazz playing in the common room, and people who looked at you when you walked in, not through you, but at you. "Welcome, Mrs. Monroe," the woman at the desk said, smiling. "We've been expecting you." It was the first time in months I had heard someone say my name like it mattered. I was shown to a corner unit with a view of the courtyard. My boxes were already there. Jake's chair had been placed near the window. On the table sat a welcome basket with jam, crackers, and a handwritten note from the director. "Thank you for helping us make this place possible. Now it's yours too." Because what they didn't know, what my son and daughter-in-law would never know, was that Willow Grove had been funded in part by the donation I made through Elder Haven. My estate was not just a transfer of assets, it was a quiet revolution. In the days that followed, I settled in. I joined the afternoon book circle. I met a retired teacher named Helen who made me laugh so hard I spilled coffee down my blouse. I started attending a watercolor class on Thursdays. I even signed up to lead a workshop on letter writing, something Jake and I had done together every Sunday for years. The best part came at 5 p.m. each evening. Someone always knocked on my door to say, "Dinner's ready," not because they wanted anything, but because they wanted me there. There was a seat with my name on it, and for the first time in a long time, I sat down without hesitation. I wasn't in the way, I wasn't tolerated, I was welcomed. The house I left behind was no longer my home, because home isn't where you store things, it's where you are wanted, and here I was finally home. 6 months passed, 6 months of silence, 6 months of peace, 6 months of morning coffee in the sunroom at Willow Grove, 6 months of learning how to sketch birds in watercolor, of hearing my name spoken with kindness, of not looking back. And then it arrived, the day I had circled in red on my private calendar, the day the letters would be delivered. What happens when the people who left you behind finally realize the door is locked and you are no longer waiting inside? 6 months passed at Willow Grove. 6 months of quiet mornings, watercolor classes, and book circles. 6 months of hearing my name spoken with kindness, never followed by a sigh. 6 months of not looking back. Then the day arrived, the one I had circled in red on my private calendar. My lawyer had promised me that letters would be delivered to my son and his wife. That morning, he sent me a short email. Letters have been delivered. By 11 o'clock, the phone started ringing. 16 calls in one day, all from my son. I watched the name flash across the screen, a name I had once loved so fiercely it nearly unmade me. Now it only triggered calm. I didn't answer, not the first call, not the third, not the 12th, not even the one at midnight. The next morning, an email arrived. The subject line read, "I'm sorry, Mom, but at least let us keep the garden." I opened it, not because I expected sincerity, but because I was curious. Curious how he would phrase it. Curious if he understood what had been lost. He wrote, "Mom, I don't know what to say. Tanya and I got the letter from the lawyer this morning, and I don't even know where to begin. We didn't think you'd actually go through with it. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe we didn't handle the airport thing right. Maybe we underestimated how hurt you were. Tanya says it wasn't meant to feel like abandonment. She just thought you'd prefer to stay a few extra days. I know that doesn't excuse anything, but this is serious. You've removed us from everything. The house, the savings, the land, even the joint account we used for the kids' school fees has been frozen. Please, Mom, at least let us keep the garden." I read his words slowly. They were not words of understanding. They were words of regret only because something had been taken away. He wanted the garden, not reconciliation. He wanted access, not forgiveness. I closed the email and sat back in my chair. Outside my window, the courtyard was alive with children visiting their grandparents, laughter echoing across the grass. I realized then that my son's words no longer had power over me. My estate was now tied to Elderhaven, ensuring that others like me would never feel invisible. My passwords were changed, my accounts secured, my future reclaimed. I had already built a new life, one that didn't depend on apologies that came too late. I poured myself a cup of coffee and carried it to the sunroom. The light streamed through the windows, warm and steady. I thought about Jake's words. Everything you plant won't grow, but what does, that's yours. That's your legacy. I had planted enough. Now it was time to grow something new. The phone rang again. I let it ring. I didn't answer, because silence was my answer. I wasn't the forgotten mother at the airport anymore. I wasn't the widow waiting for inclusion. I was Blake Monroe, a woman who had chosen her own direction, her own legacy, her own home. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. When trust is broken, strength takes its place, and strength doesn't just survive, it writes the ending. Life at Willow Grove unfolded slowly, but with a rhythm that felt steady and kind. Each morning, sunlight poured through the wide windows of my corner unit, warming the quilt I'd placed on Jake's chair. I would sit there with my coffee, listening to the soft jazz that drifted from the common room. It was a different kind of silence than the one I had known before. This silence was peaceful, not heavy. The community welcomed me in ways I hadn't expected. On my first week, I joined the afternoon book circle. We sat in a circle of chairs, each person holding a worn paperback. A retired teacher named Helen sat beside me. She had a sharp wit and a warm smile. She asked me what I liked to read, and when I hesitated, she handed me a copy of her favorite novel. "Start here," she said. That small gesture reminded me that belonging doesn't always come from family. It can come from strangers who choose to see you. Thursdays became watercolor days. I had never painted before, but the instructor encouraged us to try. My first attempt was a simple sketch of a bird perched on a branch. The colors bled together, uneven and soft, but I kept it. It wasn't about perfection. It was about learning something new, about letting my hands create instead of letting my mind dwell. I also signed up to lead a workshop on letter writing. Jake and I had written letters to each other every Sunday for years, even when we lived under the same roof. It was our way of keeping words alive. Sharing that practice with others felt like carrying a piece of him forward. The group listened as I explained how a letter could hold more than sentences. It could hold memory, intention, and care. Evenings were my favorite. At 5 o'clock sharp, someone always knocked on my door to say, "Dinner's ready." It wasn't about food. It was about being wanted. I walked to the dining hall where tables were filled with laughter and conversation. There was always a seat waiting for me. I didn't have to ask. I didn't have to wonder if I belonged. The courtyard became my sanctuary. Children visited their grandparents, running across the grass, their voices carrying joy. I would sit on a bench, watching them play, remembering Jake's words, "Everything you plant won't grow, but what does, that's yours." I realized then that Willow Grove was something I had planted without knowing, and now it was growing. 6 months passed in this rhythm. 6 months of rediscovery, 6 months of being seen, not as a burden, but as a person with value. I no longer thought of myself as the woman left behind at the airport. I was Blake Monroe, a woman who had chosen her own direction. The letters to my son and daughter-in-law had already been delivered. Their calls came, their emails arrived, but I didn't answer. My life was no longer tied to their choices. It was tied to mine. I had built something new, a home where I was wanted, a community where I was respected, a legacy that would outlast betrayal. But even in peace, the past has a way of knocking. What happens when legacy itself becomes the final chapter? The call stopped after a few days, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was steady, like the calm after a storm. I had already chosen my direction, and I had no reason to turn back. At Willow Grove, life continued with its gentle rhythm. Morning coffee in the sunroom, watercolor classes on Thursdays, book circles in the afternoons. Each day reminded me that belonging does not depend on blood, it depends on respect. I thought often about the choices I had made. Removing my son and his wife from my will was not an act of anger, it was an act of clarity. Inheritance is not just about money, it is about trust, and trust, once broken, cannot be rebuilt with late ecologies. My estate was now tied to Elder Haven, an organization that supports older adults who have been abandoned or exploited. Housing assistance, legal protection, community programs, all designed to remind people like me that they are not invisible. I knew I was not alone. I wrote a personal letter to be included with my bequest. It was not addressed to anyone specific, but to every person who might one day sit where I had sat, left behind, dismissed, treated like a burden instead of a blessing. If you are reading this, You are not invisible. You are not finished. You are not defined by those who fail to see your worth. You still have choices. You still have strength. And you still have the right to write your own story. That letter was my legacy. Not the land, not the savings, not the house. The legacy was the reminder that strength can be found even in betrayal. I updated every account, every emergency contact form. When the bank teller asked if I wanted to add a family member for access, I smiled and said, "No, just me." Those 2 words once sounded lonely. Now they sounded like survival, like freedom. I walked back to Willow Grove, passing a small park where children climbed on jungle gyms. Their laughter carried across the grass, and I sat on a bench, letting the sun warm my face. I remembered Jake's words. Everything you plant won't grow, but what does, that's yours. I had planted enough. Now it was time to grow something new. The house I left behind was no longer my home. Home is not where you store things. Home is where you are wanted. And here I was wanted. I joined more activities. I learned how to sketch birds in watercolor. I shared stories in the book circle. I led more workshops on letter writing. Each moment reminded me that I was not forgotten. I was part of something. Months later, I sat in the courtyard watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. I thought about the airport, the bench where I had first realized I was alone. I thought about the lawyer's office, the motel room, the moving truck. Each step had carried me here. I was no longer the woman left behind. I was the woman who had chosen her own ending. When betrayal tries to define you, remember this: your story is still yours to write. And sometimes the most powerful chapter begins when you finally choose yourself.